We're back again, and here is Brian Gomes with the Oyster Recovery Partnership. And we want to talk about the recovery of the waters and the oysters in the bay.
Yes. So we're going to go back and do a quick abbreviated history of
Okay.
the Chesapeake Bay watershed and why what we're doing is important today. Our friend Captain John Smith, who came up the bay in 1607, 1608, there were so many oysters in the bay. His diaries wrote of they laid as thick as stones in the water, and that their boats would run aground on the reefs. They were three-dimensional up off the bottom to break water, and they grow about an inch a year in the wild. So that's a pretty big, older oyster. The whole decline of the industry, there's kind of three parts that led to the massive decline of oysters in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. First and foremost is the overharvesting of the resource. In 1880, depending on what you read, around 12 million bushels came out of the Chesapeake. And so that was the first phase, the overharvesting of the resource. We're about 1% of what we had from the golden days of yesteryear. I believe the wild harvest last year was a little over 400,000 bushels. The second phase of the decline of oysters in the watershed is disease and predation. There's a critter in the bay known as the cow-nosed ray that can, with the shark population down, you do your whole food chain, food web. The skates and rays are right below them, so they're thriving, and they eat oysters. So if they can get their mouth around a shell, they can crush it, pop it open, and eat the oyster inside. So, and then the two diseases that have been prevalent in the bay are dermo and MSX, and they are not as bad as they were, say, 20 to 50 years ago, when oysters were all-time low numbers. And they are not immune to these diseases, but there are now pockets of disease resistance in the bay. So those are the ones that are brought into the hatchery for the large-scale spawn that have a stronger kind of bloodline.
But excuse me for a minute, how did you create, or how did it come about that there were pockets where they can't be? It just happened?
Yeah, there's just areas of the bay where they've built up resistance to
Cool.
the disease. The diseases are found in higher salinity, which is also where oysters thrive. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, is where they're going to be thriving in higher parts per thousand salinity. They're also going to see more of that disease. But there are areas that are fighting back, and the disease has dropped in the last several years. So that's a good sign. Third phase, most current issue with the decline of oysters in the bay's watershed is we have roughly 17 million people that live in the watershed, 6 states, all the way up through Cooperstown, New York, headwaters of the Susquehanna. So what's happening in south central New York and central Pennsylvania affects the whole watershed, not just what we see here in Maryland and Virginia. So it's runoff, and it's not just the nutrient runoff that is a separate issue, but dirt and silt and sediment that will come down and build up and trickle from the creek to the river to the bay and create a layer of sediment on the oyster shell. And when they go to spawn in the wild, it's external fertilization, egg and sperm meet in the water column, larval state for the 2 to 3 weeks. Again, they're going to drop down and crawl for about 48 hours looking for a permanent home base. That silt and sediment layer on that other oyster prohibits them from attaching, and they slide off and die. They cannot attach with that runoff. So they do about 10 on average, is what it comes out to, about 10 spat attached to each half shell that's in that system. The Oyster Recovery Partnership's program for shell recycling. It's called the Shell Recycling Alliance, and we started this 5 years ago with a handful of shuckers. And you would have 40, 50, 60 bushels of oysters shucked at one of these large events with several hundred people. And at the end of the event, the bushel boxes or bushel baskets would go into the dumpster. And shell is a limited natural resource, and it's important to the whole restoration effort. So today is over 200 restaurants in Virginia, D.C., Maryland, Delaware, and
The Eastern Shore.
yeah, all through here. Go to oysterrecovery.org and check out all the restaurants that are in the Shell Recycling Alliance. And as a consumer, you can make an informed decision on where you're eating and knowing that if they are in the SRA club, we are getting those oysters back for this whole restoration piece.
Talking more about history, the Chesapeake Bay, and the salinity is very important, as you were saying, to the taste of the oyster.
Yeah, the whole flavor profile depends on many things. The water temperature, the water depth, the water quality, the salinity, and what kind of algae is growing in the water there, because that's their primary food. So what they eat obviously affects their flavor, and you have the same species from Canada down to the Caribbean. It's the eastern oyster, but depending on where it's living, it gives it a different flavor profile. Or you have the terroir for land, you have the miroir for water, and
What's that mean?
it's miroir is what the water is creating the flavor.
Oh, I see.
So a Chincoteague oyster is going to taste different from a Blue Point up in New York versus a Wellfleet in Cape Cod versus a Prince Edward Island oyster. So all same species, but we definitely can taste the difference between each one depending on their region and what they're eating and their water quality.
So if an oyster is harvested from around Cambridge, is it still called a Chincoteague oyster?
No, it would need to be grown or have its final resting place before it's harvested from the Chincoteague waters. So a bay oyster is a bay oyster. A Chincoteague oyster is that. You can get them from the Delaware Bay, and you can get them up and down the Atlantic seaboard.
The watermen can get leases,
Yes.
and there are certain requirements for those leases, and then there are certain requirements for the days that they can harvest. And knowing the tradition, or not knowing it personally, but knowing that there is such an incredible tradition for the watermen, how do you see that fitting in with today's environment?
One of the programs that we have through Oyster Recovery Partnership is a remote setting program. So if you are a startup oyster farmer transitioning from being a waterman harvesting wild oysters, you can start a program. It's the first batch of larvae is provided for the grower. They just provide the shell. So this is a way that we're encouraging watermen to step into the oyster farming arena and try that out. And that program has been going on the last 3 or 4 years, and it's been very successful, and a lot of watermen are starting to participate in that program.
And Brian, you have been teaching in the elementary schools?
Middle schools as well.
Middle schools?
Yep.
Okay. And what is it that the kids really like about the oysters?
Well, unfortunately, they're not these cuddly little things that you can pet, but we bring I bring the excitement and passion of the importance of oysters to the classroom. We have an environmental education activity where they start with a clear fish tank that is representing, the water from Captain John Smith's day, and then the evolution and progress of life and industry, and showing all the runoff and
Throw in some of that plastic bottle.
the stuff that pollutes our watershed. And then at the end we discuss who polluted the Chesapeake, and the students see that everyone was involved in that, and we talk about ways to improve the water quality, and that oysters are filter feeders and work to help clean the water column and watershed. And then we have life cycle oysters, and then we also show oyster dissection in the classroom
Cool.
too, and kids can
Cool.
see what lives inside this hard shell.
So we're going to wrap it up, and I wish that we could dissect an oyster because I know it's fascinating. One of the things that we had talked about was taking in those nutrients, and if the oyster doesn't seem to like whatever it is that was brought in, how does it get rid of it?
It's a good question. People are concerned with benthic critters and that they're, eating the stuff off the bottom, or catfish and crabs, this whole issue with these bottom feeders. Well, oysters will pull organic matter out of the algae, and those nutrients are digested. And I'm the education outreach guy, not the science guy, so I like to say the crappier crab, they do not ingest, and is balled up into little mucus balls and expelled. So that's known as pseudofeces, and they do not ingest that. So that is deposited on the side of the reef, and lower life forms like amphipods in the
They like
oyster
that
reef.
stuff.
Yeah, that's their dinner.
That's cool.
So, and another important part of oysters out there is just the great habitat they create. So we talk about harvesting oysters, whether they're wild or farm raised, but just the reefs out there, the natural occurring reefs that are magnets for habitat. If you pulled up a clump of oysters, you're going to have all these little bait fish and gobies and feathered blennies that are flopping around in there, and little mud crabs. And if you go up your proverbial food chain, food web to your secondary consumers, you're going to have two, what we like to call cash crops, that come out of the bay that we're very well known for in the Chesapeake Bay region. So I'm going to quiz you here on the spot. If oysters are creating the habitat, what are two important seafoods that we pull from the bay?
Well, around here you would say oysters. I mean, I'm sorry, you would say crabs.
Yes, number one answer, and the other one's a fish.
Well, I know rockfish is
Yes.
one of the best, I think.
You nailed it. So when you have a healthy, productive oyster bar, you're going to have a lot of blue crabs and a lot of striped bass or rockfish, and that's what greases the seafood industry. So there's your economic value added of oysters in the bay. The ecological benefits are, one of these guys can filter, do you know how many gallons in a day?
I used to identify 4.
50.
Oh, 50.
50 gallons. So you fill up a bathtub full of bay water and drop that guy in there, they're going to be able to filter through it. So very efficient filter feeders. All the other critters that live on the bay or on the reef, including mussels and barnacles, are contributing to that filtering ability. So cleaning the water, creating important habitat, and just a huge kind of unsung hero in our Chesapeake Bay watershed.
Well, I can't thank you enough for educating us more about the oyster in our Chesapeake Bay, and we will, let's see, it's the end of March.
It is. So with the long, cold winter we had,
Yeah.
the wild harvest season was extended 2 weeks. So where today normally is the end of the oyster season, they had a 2-week extension because a lot of the rivers were frozen over. So there's a continuation of the season to allow watermen to get out there and get more oysters.
Okay, you guys, so you have 2 weeks more to go eat some oysters and to ask the restaurateur, do you put your shells back into the Oyster Recovery Partnership? Brian, thank you for being with us, and we'll see you later.
Thank you, Carla.